Okay, everyone, we should be live. Welcome to the final episode of TBRCon for 2025. I am your host, Mike, from Mike's Book Reviews, and I'm happy to be joined today by some wonderful authors to talk about all those things that go bump in the night, namely vampires and zombies and werewolves, oh my. But we're going to be talking today about this new era and how we go about keeping that thing fresh, because it has been done for quite a while, and it's probably going to keep being done for quite a while longer as well. So I'm going to kind of go around the horn here and let everyone kind of introduce themselves, and we'll kick that off with Laura. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, I'm Laura Purcell. I write mainly gothic fiction. I've dealt with a lot of ghosts in my stories, and just recently I'm branching out into some gothic monsters. I've been exploring werewolves, and in my work in progress, a evil unicorn.
Oh, nice. Ed? Ed, I think you're next.
I don't think he can hear you.
Okay.
Did you say me?
I did, yeah.
I don't know why I didn't hear you. Sorry. I was so hung up on Laura's unicorn. I just went to my own and started thinking about unicorns. So, anyway, no unicorns. I'm Ed Crocker. I've written the Everlands trilogy, which is fantasy with vampires and werewolves, basically making vampires and werewolves really boring and political and class warfare and stuff. The first book, Lightfall, came out last week, which was nice in North America. That's me.
And Nat.
Hello. I'm Nat Cassidy. I have written books like Mary, which kind of takes the old tropes of ghosts and reincarnation and serial killers and kind of sticks them in a blender. And Nestlings, which also took the trope of vampires and kind of gave it a new-ish bent to it, looking at it from a Jewish lens and setting it in modern day New York City. And my next book, which is coming out when the wolf comes home, a camera's mirrored, so I don't know which direction to do it, is kind of taking werewolf tropes and taking that in some new directions. Formerly a playwright, and a lot of my plays were also apropos to today's theme of taking old tropes and kind of reimagining, finding new place for them. Zombies, demons, you name it. I love stuff like that.
I think we all do. Johnny.
I'm Johnny Compton. I have written 2 novels, The Spite House, which is a haunted house story set inside a spite house. And if you're unfamiliar with what a spite house is, you can probably guess based on the name, and I encourage you to look it up because it's fascinating. And then my second book, which came out late last year, October of last year, Devils Kill Devils, which is a vampire novel. And that's me.
All right, Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz. I also wrote a vampire novel. I wrote 2 of them. The Night's Edge duology. The first one came out in 2023. The sequel, First Light, came out in April 2024. And they basically use vampirism as a way to dissect codependent relationships. It's kind of more of a family drama than, a vampire thriller. Although the sequel kind of opened that up a little bit, but that's mainly the thrust of it, is this girl and her mother who's a vampire.
Yeah. And Miss Pierlot. Am I saying your name right?
Yeah. So I'm Ciel Pierlot, which is a name most people take a couple tries to pronounce correctly, and never gets said right on a roll call sheet. I have written a vampire novel, which I have right here. You can go buy this. It came out in August. And I focused on writing vampires that kind of go back to the original roots of true monstrosity. On my Twitter, I described it as the inherent monstrous eroticism of vampires. And also some ghosts just thrown in because honestly, ghosts are kind of great, and I missed like classic hauntings as a category.
Right on, right on. So before we get into everything about, well, first, welcome everybody. Thank you for everyone for making it. And before we get into, I guess, how to keep this genre fresh, kind of talk about some influences here. Everyone seems like they've kind of had one foot in at least with the horror pool here, and the water is always warm when it comes to that. And I think my first horror book I ever read was Bram Stoker's Dracula. So I've been enamored with vampires ever since. Read Salem's Lot right after that, So it's something I've always been quite interested in. Haven't read as much zombies as you would think. I've watched a lot of zombie movies and stuff. But I'd be curious to know if you guys just want to kind of discuss some of your influences. What kind of led you to writing about these monsters of the night? And anyone can just take it away. Just jump in.
I mean, for me, and I think this is probably true for everybody that writes vampires, Dracula, kind of the classic influence. For me personally, one of the things that influenced me to start writing more classic monsters was disliking a lot of modern interpretations. I really didn't like Twilight. I'm so sorry to everybody who did.
We could get support there.
Yeah. I feel like we've seen kind of a modern sort of trend with Twilight, Teen Wolf, a lot of sort of turning monsters into kind of teen dramas. And so for me, I wanted to get back into the Draculas kind of as a response to that. I'm relatively young. I'm still in my 20s. So for me, Twilight was like middle school, high school. And it led me to rediscovering Dracula, honestly, Carmilla, great. Love it. Classic.
Yeah, I mean, Camilla, that was a huge influence for me as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, we got the idea at the same time. Go for it.
Yeah, well, originally, so I've written a young adult novel with werewolves in it, and I wanted to write basically a Camilla with werewolves in the same historic period as well. Ended up veering slightly from that with some influence from my publishers, but yeah, Camilla was a huge influence for me. Even though that's a vampire novel and I wasn't writing about vampires, just the atmosphere and the monstrosity and the horror of it was really appealing.
I think with even if you don't write vampires, Carmilla is an inspiration. I think a lot of monsters, the themes are all very overlapping. The vibes are all very overlapping. So one can inspire you to write another,
Mm-hmm. I think the Anne Rice Interview with the Vampire series was my first big, toe in the water, so to speak. I was really into the twisted family dynamics of this, these two men and this little girl, and how messed up their weird little circle was, and and just the psychological imbalance between Louis and Lestat, and just to me it was a dysfunctional family drama disguised as a vampire novel. And I don't know if anybody has watched the new AMC series, but they really just go hard in that direction, and that's why I think it's perfect. I love it. I'm like, thank you. That's what this book was about. So that to me was like my way into writing the books I eventually wrote. Because I'm like, this has sort of been done, but I'm going to, mix up the family dynamics a little bit and tell something that's a little more personal to me. But yeah, that literally parasitic relationship says a lot. So that's kind of how I got in.
So glad to hear that, because Anne Rice, one of my 10 favorite authors of all time. My high school wasn't Twilight, thank God. It was the Vampire Chronicles. And when I discovered that, it was like the first thing that got me off of reading just Stephen King was when I found the Vampire Chronicles. And so yeah, I'm glad to hear someone else bring that up. And yeah, you nailed exactly what makes that great. Anyone else want to talk about some influences?
It's funny that Liz just said about Interview with the Vampire, because my very first experience with vampires was when I was about 10 years old, and my dad, who thankfully isn't watching, so he won't mind I'm getting him into trouble, let me watch Interview with the Vampire, the film, I should say. It was obviously in the 90s, and it terrified me. So I had nightmares about vampires for months afterwards. So you think that's a terrible start, right? But obviously, I got over that. And then I read Salem's Lot and started just sort of reading all the vampire fiction I could read in my teenage years. But weirdly for me, my biggest vampire influence for my books has been actually more fantasy, because there's a book by Terry Pratchett in the Discworld series called The Fifth Elephant, if anyone's read the Discworld series. And it basically does vampires and werewolves in fantasy. So they live in this sort of special place, and it's all political and stuff. And I read that and I was like, oh, wow, you can do vampires and werewolves in fantasy. I did not realize you could do that. And I just stole that idea, and that's just my series basically. So I've loved vampires since I was little in horror, and I read all the horror books at the moment. But it was actually Terry Pratchett that got me writing about them, which is a bit weird, I guess.
Yeah, and while we're on the subject of vampires, for me personally, for Nestlings, I have been a huge horror fan my entire life, a horror obsessive, and have always loved vampire stories. And it was kind of like during the beginning stages of the pandemic and stuff like that. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the air around that time, and I wanted to write a vampire story. And I was kind of sitting down with the classical, the classical texts, your Draculas, your Carmillas, Varney the Vampire, all of them, and just kind of realizing that they were grounded in sort of baseline classical anti-Semitic tropes. These conspiratorial creatures who prey on good Christian blood, and they live in the shadows, and they love real estate deals, and all these things like that. And I was like, that's interesting. I can't really think of a good vampire story that's from a Jewish perspective. The cross works, holy water works. What if you don't believe in that stuff? So I wanted to take all those classical tropes and just kind of reevaluate them from a different vantage point. And there's another greats doing a lot of work here. Great is relative, but it was made into just a terrible movie, and the book itself is great, called The Keep by F. Paul Wilson. That is another one that is about it's set during World War II, and these Nazis take a keep in like the Romanian mountains, and a vampiric creature starts feeding off of the SS that are stationed there. And so they don't know what to do, and they get this Jewish folklore historian who lives in the area, and makes him come and solve the mystery of what is killing all these Nazis. And it turns out that the cross works against the vampire, and it throws them into this huge crisis of faith. And that was the first time I'd ever really encountered wrestling with these myths in a really satisfying narrative way. And I love how kind of a theme that is running through all these answers already is a sort of dissatisfaction with the current state of the tropes. This feeling of these classic monsters aren't being handled in a way that is speaking to me right now. So I need to kind of take that and refashion them into something that is speaking to me in the moment. I think that's so empowering for an author to kind of take this thing that you're so familiar with, that is so foundational to you, and being like, you know what? It's not being done right now.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I guess echoing a lot of similar sentiments, just wanting to take it from a kind of hopefully unique perspective, or not unique, nothing's entirely unique, but relatively speaking, as much as you can. And I've been fascinated since I was a kid with folklore, and I'm particularly fascinated with, in terms of vampire folklore, witches, werewolves, etc., going back to very, very early texts. And I cite some of them at the end of Devils Kill Devils that were influential to me. And Montague Summers, the vampire, his kith and kin, these old texts from 18th century, 17th century, 15th, 16th century, written by people who believed in vampires, and would give you all these bizarre accounts of alleged vampires. And I read up on a lot of those, and there were originally a lot more references overtly to alleged real vampires that had attacked certain specific towns, and characters were named based on that. And my editor, God bless her, was like, this is all fascinating, but also these are some weird names, some of them, and probably very obscure references, and is this for the reader or is this for you? And it's like, oh, well, admittedly, I can get a little self-indulgent, but that's where a lot of my influence for that came from the books that I have or had, because I've given a few away recently, but had at the house the Vampire Encyclopedia and the Dudley Wright book on vampires and the crossover they have with werewolves and witchcraft and all these weird quirks of the past. There's so much cool, weird stuff that I couldn't get into, obviously. And it's like vampires that or suspected vampires that were buried with a brick in their mouth. And it's it's kind of cooler and weirder than a stake in the heart, as awesome as the stake in the heart is and traditional. It's like vampires with a scythe, buried with a scythe over your neck. So I guess if you sprung to life, you would just get decapitated. It's kind of a built-in trap. That's amazing. I'm like, if I can get just a toe in the water in that, and hopefully other people can explore even more of that, because I'd love to read fiction centered on these bizarre little things that predate even Dracula and Lord Riven and Carmilla, and all these other highly influential texts, but the versions of them that predate all of that. I feel like there's a universe of vampirism and lycanthropy and whatever you want to define a zombie as, and ghouls and stuff that hasn't been explored because people, maybe aren't thinking of what did they think of these creatures back in the 13th century. But I promise they wrote about them. And not only did they write about them, they wrote about them as if they were real, because that's what they believed at the time. And it's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. I don't know, do you consider Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? Would you consider that a zombie? That's always been kind of a debate, I think, in the horror community, if you would consider that a zombie.
Yeah, I think so. If you think about it.
I think that could be considered the original zombie, yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Or an early version, yeah.
Well, as far as influences, I'm not a writer. If I did, it would just be writing Buffy the Vampire Slayer cosplay, and I don't think everybody wants that. So that's just what it is.
Everyone wants that.
It's one of my favorite shows of all time. So
have you gone on Archive of Our Own and seen the Buffy tag? Trust me, everybody wants that.
Okay.
I want that.
I have it.
I'm on board.
I rewatch Buffy and Angel like constantly. I kind of want to talk about each one of y'all something here that has a little bit on my list right now. Let's start with Nat. Now you have a book coming out called When the Wolf Comes Home. Is it might to presume this is a werewolf story?
Yeah, you can presume that. I don't know how accurate the presumption is, but you can presume away, baby.
Do you want to tell me anything about it?
It does take a fair amount of inspiration from werewolf tropes. I'm being cagey because it's not quite a werewolf novel in the same way that Nestlings ultimately isn't quite a vampire novel. But it is taking the idea of change, the idea of kind of monster taking over, that I think is fundamentally the lifeblood of a classical werewolf story. That feeling of lack of control, that feeling of escalating monstrosity, and then reversion back to the humanity. I think that one of the werewolves were always one of my favorite monsters, if not my favorite monster growing up. And one of the things I love about werewolves is that, unlike, say, a vampire or a zombie or a Frankenstein's monster or your creatures of the Black Lagoon and whatnot, there's a reversion that the werewolf has. The werewolf becomes a human again. The werewolf doesn't get to stay a werewolf, and so the werewolf has to deal with the horrors that it has caused, the blood sloshing in its stomach. Like a human has to process that, and there's something so poignant and fascinating about that. So When the Wolf Comes Home, this novel of mine that comes out April 22nd, 2025, wherever books are sold, is leaning into that idea that what is monstrous is not always monstrous, and how do you process that? How do you process that being a human again, and then living in the world with what you've done?
And added to the TBR. All right. Outstanding work. Laura, I'm a big Stephen King fan, and I do remember him actually talking about the Roanoke Falls podcast that you did for a little bit, correct?
Really? Did he?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. It was either a tweet or a newsletter or something. Because I know
Oh my God.
he did say it was a good listen or something like that. That's what led me to listen to it because he's been obsessed with Roanoke for
Nobody told me this. That's very exciting.
Yeah. So I mean, okay, cool. I'm glad I can make your day with that. How did that come about? Like, because I mean, I love like a good documentary. When you're going to put like the horror spin on a documentary, that's something that's just really exciting.
Yeah. So I was approached by Realm, who did the podcast, with this kind of bare bones story idea they had. And again, this was during the pandemic because, what I would have loved to have done if it wasn't during lockdown is I would have loved to have gone out to Roanoke and done some really deep dive into the history and stuff. But, I did as much as I could. And Realm had this very good idea. They wanted to work on a kind of slasher mythology that they were working on with Sandy King, Carpenter, and John Carpenter, and they sort of said, we think you might be the right voice for this. So yeah, I got to use a whole new medium of audio drama, and and finally write a bit of a slasher, which was amazing for me because I'm always wanting to go a bit further horror than maybe my publisher is comfortable with. So with this, I just had free license, and it was like, yeah, I can get as gory and as into it as I want.
It's really, really cool. Listen, Ciel, I want to talk about the Hunter's Gambit because one of my favorite booktubers is Leslie over at Nerdy Narrative, and she was really talking about this about 7-8 months ago, I think, and that got on here. Just anything else you can tell me about it? Just kind of what are we getting into here? I think you're on mute.
Whoopsies. Sorry, I have like a physical built into the microphone mute button and then also the mute button here, and I never know which one I press. My bad. So Hunter's Gambit. I really wanted to write the sort of when I conceived of it, it was an anti-Twilight. Again, I had to live through Twilight in middle school and high school. You don't understand. It was everywhere. Strangers would be asking you if you were Team Edward or Team Jacob. It was a nightmare. Literally, the dedication in this book is
that's a horror story in its own right there.
It really was. The dedication is dedicated to everybody who read Twilight and thought, why are these vampires so Mormon? This was the anti-Twilight. If you like Twilight, I don't hate you as a person. I hate the phenomenon that Twilight was. So when I started writing this, I really drew on my love of the sort of monstrous nature of vampires. Not the, oh, I'm so conflicted, I'm gonna like brood about it. Do I need to go drink animal blood instead so I can be like a good pure Mormon boy? Again, no hate if you like Twilight, please don't hate me. And I decided, screw it, I'm gonna write vampires that are all in on the murder, all in on the blood and guts, all in on the like lack of humanity. Snuck in a little bit of anti-capitalist messaging because that's my brand. I love writing that. And I really wanted to lean into that. I wanted to lean into that sort of classic, locked in a castle type of vibe that you can get from Dracula. I wanted to lean into the sort of eroticism that you see in Dracula, but also, in like Carmilla, in the Vampire with Lord Riven being portrayed as like a seducer of, a poor innocent woman in the story. Although, don't worry, my protagonist is not a poor innocent woman. She commits many crimes and many murders. I don't want to spoil anything if people do by chance want to read my book. But that's kind of where I came from. I wanted to embrace the sort of blood, guts, and gore of
I'm
vampires.
so happy to hear that because I said a while back, I think I was talking about Empire of the Vampire, and I was like, it's so weird to finally feel like vampires are scary again, not just they can be sexy too, but the fact that they would rather eat you than date you, which is weird coming from a
Unfortunately,
Buffy fan.
there are both in this. There
Sure,
is
can be both,
a
but I still want to be scared of the vampires in the end. You
yes,
know?
yeah. There's a lot of vampires that are evil and scary, and then there is also some on-screen spicy bits. If you don't like that, please feel free to skip through a chapter of this book.
I can imagine people that audiobook those. That's got to be really, really awkward to listen to. I don't know. I'm not an audiobooker. So.
You know, I'm not an audiobooker either, so I also don't have an answer to that question.
Ed, amigo, I am in chapter
Hello.
5 right now, so I'm still going. But you were kind of touched on it a little bit earlier about kind of doing something a little different. So he cheated. He's using vampires and werewolves, and he threw in magicians because why not? You know. So you want to tell us a little bit more about Lightfall and what you were going for?
I should have done zombies as well, shouldn't I? Could have got them all in. Yeah, so I guess I feel like sometimes there's a binary choice of vampires where they're either sexy or they're scary. And I tend to prefer scary, but I've gone for the third choice, which is boring. So what I'm really interested in is what would vampires and werewolves be like if there were no humans? So there's no humans in my world. It's a secondary fantasy world. It's just a world of immortals, and there's no humans. So I'm interested in how they act politically, and I guess sticking with vampires, the things that really interest me is first of all the idea of blood. So what if you had a society that was based on the idea of the poor getting weak blood and the rich getting like really good blood that makes you clever, that makes you strong, that makes you powerful? So it's that idea of poverty, but you're literally defined by the blood you drink. So it's a very obvious and slightly stupid analogy to the poverty trap, I guess. But it's really fun to explore because they are literally trapped in their poverty because they can't get good blood. So I guess it's a way of examining anti-capitalist themes as well, like we were saying before. But I'm also interested in like the immortality aspect. So what is a society like if a lot of people have just been living 300 and 400 years? So you sort of see that a bit in, a lot of recent books, films, the underworld films. You sort of get, vampires and werewolves, and they're all really old, although they kind of act like young people a lot of the time, which doesn't make sense, but whatever. But what I'm really interested in is like, how would that affect wars and conflicts? Like the vampires and werewolves in my books, they hate each other, but imagine some of the conflicts in our world at the moment and how awful they are and how much they've hated each other for decades or even centuries. But imagine they all had the memories of the centuries before. It would be awful. It would be genuinely quite nasty. And how do you handle that? And the idea of grief as well. What if your husband or your wife has died 300 years ago and you just had 300 years of being incredibly sad? How does that change you as a person? And what I'm really interested in, this will show how pretentious I am, is like existentialism. There's a great book that's just come out, been republished by Shortwave Press, called Our Own Unique Affliction by Scott J. Moses. And I read that recently. It's like one of the best books I've read recently. And they're basically about vampires that are really sad because they've lived a few centuries and they're basically having an existentialist crisis. So what I mean, I don't do that as well. But what I'm really interested in is this idea of, after a few centuries, what is the point? Like, how are you going to find meaning in your life? Because you've seen it all. You've seen your loved ones die. And it's just like, what is the point? So sounds quite depressing when I put it like that. Actually, just please buy my book. But yeah, I think when you put vampires and werewolves, terrible pitch. When you put vampires and werewolves and take away the humans and take away the scares and take away the sex and the vampire orgasms, whatever, what you're left with like existentialism, depression, war, a weird blood monetary system, and that's kind of what I'm interested in, I guess.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm on 50 pages, and it's just like a murder mystery to me, but it sounds like I got a lot more to go.
Yeah, you got about 2 books to go before it gets good. Sorry, mate.
Can I ask
Johnny,
a question? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just wondering if anybody else came across a folklore that I did. There's Ed was mentioning this famous rivalry between like vampires and werewolves.
Yeah.
I came across some Slavic folklore that said a werewolf, when they die, becomes a vampire, which was really interesting to me because I was like, well, that completely turns that rivalry idea on its head, that they from the same source. I wondered if anybody else came across that in their research, or if that was just me.
I
No.
didn't
Oh, wow.
find that, but I found someone else analyzing that, and then I couldn't find the original source. I actually incorporated kind of an influence of the analysis into mine, which is I don't know if this is actually the meaning of the original folklore, or if it was just, again, the person I was reading who was analyzing the original folklore kind of talked about how both vampires and werewolves oftentimes can represent sort of repressed emotions or repressed desires, like with werewolves, it can be kind of repressed anger or repressed animal characteristics, the desire to sort of like go feral, and how that can be similar to vampires in terms of the sort of repressed desires. So I saw an analysis of that. I know what you're talking about. I didn't find the source. I found a like tertiary source talking about it.
It's like 2 monsters for the price of one. I mean, that's an idea for somebody. You think you've killed the werewolf and it comes back as a vampire. Amazing.
Yeah, it's like a hydra.
I always thought it was a bit of a cheat too when like classic vampires could also turn into wolves. And I was like, come on, you can't do that. That's somebody else's thing. Like,
let them turn into bats.
Yeah.
Let them turn into bats more. I love that shit.
This. Yeah, what the hell? Yeah. It's like, you're way too OP, man. You're already OP. What are you going to make them turn into?
Exactly. Greedy.
Okay, thank
Johnny,
you.
I did want to ask you about the Spite House, because I something caught my ear really early was the word Texas. I am in Texas, and I do love a good haunted house story. And a haunted house story that takes place in the People's Republic. I'm excited about this. Can you tell me anything more about it? Did you hear me?
Oh man, about the Spite House. First of all, I don't advocate for Texas very much. People's Republic. I'm kind of anti-Texas these days, but that's an entirely different vibe. I'm no longer a proud Texan, but I have to put it in my bio for God knows what reason. But the Spite House does take place in the hill country of Texas, which is kind of also where Devils Kill Devils ends up. And this is some unusual territory to be explored when most books in Texas, and I think most people outside of Texas, tend to think of either the cities or you think of West Texas and kind of more desert land. And there's this hill country area, and it is somewhat hilly, not massively hilly in terms of what you would compare to with other parts of the country where the hills are towering to a different degree. But there's a lot of lore, spooky area out there. And so between that and trying to kind of emulate what the small town vibe of being in the hills in Texas feels like a little bit, and then trying to dive into what it would be like, not just for a house to be haunted, but it extrapolates into basically the entire town being haunted because of something in its history. I really wanted to get into that with the Spite House, and hopefully I did it successfully. The reception to it seems to have been pretty good, and I'm very fortunate for that. So, the Spite House takes place in this fictional town that is trying to summon up all those energies of places like the Devil's Backbone out in the hill country, where there are supposed hauntings related to various things in the past that you can imagine that took place in the South. And the Spite House likewise is partly inspired by a real massacre. Part of the background for the hauntings that afflict the entire town are inspired by a real massacre that took place during the Civil War, with German people trying to remain loyal to the Union and refusing to be conscripted by the Confederacy, and then seeking an escape into Mexico and being tracked down and slaughtered, and what kind of legacy that leaves. And so getting into that as well, that aspect, on top of so many other influences that I had in the Spite House. There's a lot to unpack because it was my first novel, and I'd been trying to break through for God knows how long, it feels like. And so I kind of had a little bit of first novel syndrome, where I wanted to put every idea I had in there, because what if I don't get another chance? So there's a lot going on in a relatively short space in that book. Probably the same affliction can be chalked up to Devils Kill Devils 2 to a certain extent as well.
And Liz, I think I first heard of Night's Edge. I can't remember what video it was I made. It might have been Jay Kristoff's Empire of the Vampire, where I got a lot of people talking about that series and recommending that series in there. And then you can tell me about it.
Yeah. So I kind of strayed away from any mythology about vampirism that was like too tried and true. I kind of just I just wanted to do a family story, like I said, and I wanted to explore codependency and parasitic relationships. And so to me, I think I was always trying to find a way in to talk about like parentification, which is when a kid is forced to take on a parent role when their parent cannot do that duty anymore. And that imbalance in a family. So I just, it kind of clicked that like, well, what would you do if your parent was a vampire and suddenly you had to help them out? And, what it just became a pretend as if, and everything just kind of snowballed. Put yourself in the shoes of this little girl and her mom is, going out on dates and killing people. Like, okay, well, now I have to help her hide the body. And now we have to run away to Mexico. But then she just killed this other person at the bus stop. So now we have to stay here. Like, and then another aspect of this story that really got its hooks in me early on was, obviously a lot of vampire mythology is an allegory for sex. And I did want to like give that its due. And so, this one of the two central romantic relationships in the books is, it's a vampire and human relationship where like it's an abusive relationship where eventually he doesn't want her to leave him. So he turns her into a vampire because she will need him. So that's, it's sexy and horrifying in the same breath. So I was like trying to carve that out. And then the daughter, Mia, is attracted to this girl that she meets, and she's so sexually repressed and so confused about who she is that she thinks this girl must be a vampire and is trying to seduce her because there's no way she could possibly like a girl. Why would that be? I was having fun just playing with the vampire sexual mythos as well. I don't know. I really enjoyed living in this world, and I was really psyched that we got a sequel. And it's, I spent like 4 years so entrenched in this world with these characters that now that I'm writing new stuff, and I'm like, oh, how did I do this again? Who are these people? So yeah.
This makes me think of this book I read by John Lindqvist called "Let the Right One In," where he finds out his neighbor is a vampire and he has to like help her and stuff. That
was definitely also very much an influence for me as well. And the is a Swedish film it was done.
They've done both. Yeah. Kick-Ass in it. The American one had the girl from Kick-Ass in it. Chloe Martez, is that her name?
Yes.
I watched both versions. The Swedish one's much more faithful to the book. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, the Swedish one's incredible.
I love the Swedish one. I actually never saw the American one, but definitely that very grounded, very human aspect of the world building was influential, no doubt.
Before we get into the big topic here that I guess we're supposed to be talking about, anybody seen Nosferatu yet? Since we're talking about vampires, I haven't seen it yet. I've heard it's really good.
It's amazing.
Is it? I'm kind of iffy on Eggers. I love some stuff, and other stuff I'm kind of like, I guess it's over my head. Like Lighthouse was over my head. I was like, whoa, I don't know what's going on here. But Hark, okay. But I love Northman. I thought that was incrable. So I'm really anxious.
I think you'll like it. I think you'll like it. It just hits all the notes you want it to hit, and just visually, it's just amazing. But yeah, I know I really enjoyed The Witch, and I
want to share my witch mug.
Yeah, amazing. I love it.
I'm just like, while we're talking about The Witch, hold on, I have to show her this. Continue.
Nosferatu was just incredible. I think
I like the original silent movie, so this is going to be exciting. Yeah. I'm very, very excited to see this. Okay, awesome. So I guess the big topic here is, how do we keep these things fresh? Because obviously vampires seem to be, you know, if we're ranking these here, this is probably the most done one is vampires, I feel like. But, you know, outside of vampires want to drink your blood, zombies want to eat your brain, werewolves want to kill the shit out of you, I guess. You know, those greatest hits are always going to kind of be there. So how do you, you know, pay homage to those kinds of things if that's what you want to do, but also try to keep it a little fresh? What are some things that we can do? Because, you know, these have been done for a long time, you know, and they're gonna persevere. But, you know, how do you keep from just, you know, recycling the greatest hits, as it were? And floor is open. Anybody just wants to jump in, go for it.
I did an early version of Night's Edge, kind of like hewed closer to the vampire repellents that are more traditional. And a new draft, one of the notes I got was like, think harder, try harder with that. And then I did. And one of the things that is now so essential to that world is that caffeine is the big deterrent for them, that if you have consumed a large cup of coffee, you know, 2 hours ago, they're not going to want to drink your blood because caffeine
that'd be safe.
Yeah, exactly. So they're allergic to you.
I'm fine.
So if you just keep chugging coffee all day long, or if you pop caffeine pills, they will be allergic to you and they'll be able to smell it on you and be like, oh, never mind, not that guy. So it becomes like, you know, this whole linchpin in the world is the caffeine allergy. So that was kind of fun to play with.
That's a neat idea. Yeah.
I think kind of honestly leaning into that in the same way. I think one of the ways in which you can sort of freshen these things up is by really thinking about what setting are you in and how you can ground the sort of traditional mythos in that setting. Like, you know, caffeine, that's a much more modern thing. People these days consume a lot more coffee. So that would be like a bigger threat, essentially. Because I think, you know, oftentimes if you take like, you know, wooden stakes and crosses deter vampires, but you're writing in, you know, set in 2024, nobody's carrying around a wooden stake in their purse or like a giant cross. So it becomes something that's not relevant, essentially. So I think there's an extent to which things can be refreshed and spiced up by thinking much more holistically about the world that you're setting your book in and what makes sense for that.
I think Buffy proved you can use anything as a stake, just about.
Didn't she also use a rocket launcher though? And nobody's carrying those around.
Sure. you use the tools you have at hand.
I need to tell you this. I'm in the lounge with my guinea pig, whose name is also Buffy, after Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Nice. And every time someone says her name, she's getting very excited. I just need to share that.
Incredible.
Keep shouting Buffy. Yeah, so building on, I guess, what we just said, I think we don't really need to try hard to keep vampires and werewolves fresh, because I think by definition, they're always fresh. Because if you think of when the legends were originally kind of, you know, in the Middle Ages, when vampires and werewolves, and even before then in the Dark Ages, one of the reasons they came about was because sort of fear of the unknown. So, you know, you've got all these villages that have disease. Like werewolves are a great example of this. You know, you have wolves coming in, eating babies, and no one knows what's going on. Everyone's really religious. And so it's basically like the working class fear of the unknown and disease. And, vampirism partly came about from no one knew what diseases were, you know, back in the Middle Ages. So it makes much more sense to have this idea of this thing that can pass on this disease rather than have someone foaming at the mouth, or, you know, maybe you go back and you dig up the grave and, oh my God, are they still alive? No, they just had they died of some crazy mad thing. Well, they don't know that because they don't know anything. And these days, so I think it's similar these days. So I think one of the reasons why vampires and werewolves are coming back, in my opinion, well, not coming back, they've never gone. But one of the reasons why they're so potent at the moment, and, you know, like people on this panel are doing so much crazy stuff with them, is because we're in this sort of era where late stage capitalism is just destroyed. I don't want to get too political, and I'm going to, you know, stick ideological, not political. but it's kind of destroying everything, right? You know, the wage gap is increasing. Everyone's feeling no one knows what's going to happen in the next 20 years. We're probably all going to die from climate change. There's probably going to be like a mass far right movement that's going to take over Europe. I mean, that might not happen, but I'm an edgelord, so I always predict the worst thing that's going to happen. So I feel like vampires and werewolves can sort of help us understand that, because if vampires are this idea of a blood-sucking creature, well, our blood is being sucked, he says, thinking of the metaphor as he goes. Our blood is being sucked by society or the late stage capitalism. And so everyone's really on edge. Everyone's really anxious and no one knows what's going to happen. I mean, we've had Brexit, we've had the pandemic. It's an edgy time to be alive. And so I don't think you have to work very hard to make them fresh again, because you just speak to your truth. You just speak to how you're being alive. You just speak to the fact that, in America, people are worried about their healthcare. Over here, people have not had a pay increase for years if they're teachers. Everyone's anxious. And I think it's very easy to sit down and write vampires and werewolves in that modern day setting, because vampires and werewolves prey on fear. They prey on the fear of disease or the fear of change, and they always have done. And this year, the last 5 years has been one of the most unstable periods in history. So I don't think you have to try that hard really to make them fresh.
No,
I
I
like what-
completely.
Sorry, I hope that didn't get too political. I mean,
No, I was gonna say. Sorry, go for it.
I just wanted to say that I love what you just pointed out, that like you use the world that you know to tell this story. You are living through it. And that I also explored like the woes of the American healthcare system in my books. So yes, it's very relevant.
It was a really excellent way of putting it too, that like there are certain things we don't know at any point, and our classical monsters tend to rush to fill that space. So like in the early days of vampire mythology, it was a scientific vacuum that was being filled. Why are corpses still bleeding? Why are people dying of anemia and stuff like that? And you look at like some of the more modern classics, like Salem's Lot is literally, what if Dracula came to small town America? And then, that's enough of a hook. But what that book is really about is the death of the American dream in the 1970s. And what is it like for these small towns to start just dying? As the last time we went through this this kind of cycle of boom and bust. And right before that, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson was kind of like the first post-atomic age vampire story. What is it? What are the scientific reasons behind vampirism? And what does that look like in almost this like re-extrapolated version of the nuclear holocaust, where everyone is dead except one dude trying to figure out what happened? The world has ended in a way that only someone who has just kind of lived through the first couple of years of the atomic scare can really conceptualize. Everyone is gone. The world is over. Liz's duology, I think, is like one that I talk about all the time. It's like one of the best sort of unintentional, if I may say so, Liz, metaphors of living through the pandemic, because like it was like contemporaneous to the pandemic almost in a way. It's like live footage of living through a pandemic. But Liz writes it so clairvoyantly, so clearly, that it documents kind of what it is like even now, just kind of the way systems fall apart in the face of something affecting some people, not all people. Right. Some people get really sick, and some people are really vulnerable. And how does society fall apart when it's dealing with these things? So I just to cycle it back to what Ed said, I think that's a really smart way to look at it. There are sometimes you can look at a monster trope and be like, well, what is that saying about the human condition and the urge that people have? Romero zombies are all about 80s capitalism and things like you can put a kind of intellectual veneer to it, but really what it comes down to is just like, what is the thing we don't know right now? What is the thing that we're really fucking scared of right now?
Yeah. I did write it during the pandemic, but it was, it was like every day wondering, you wake up and you're stuck in your house with your family and you're like, oh God, we can never leave and we don't know what's next. And yeah, and all the misinformation on the internet, that's in there. Yeah, yeah. It's read it if you're emotionally over 2020, but who is? So.
I'm glad you mentioned I Am Legend. That's just such an underrated damn book. And it sounds weird to say it's underrated because everyone that's read it says it's amazing. I just feel like when you talk about best vampire books, it never comes up. And I put it on my top 10 horror novels of all time because I think that just the solitary of that story is actually the scariest. It's scarier than the vampires, and I think that's a message that at least I took from it. Just, yeah, incredible.
Yeah, and it does a thing that I always love that some other kind of modern classical books do, but it lets the monsters talk.
Yeah,
like he's able to have a conversation with them, and that just makes it so much richer. Because ultimately, you're like, oh, we're not so different, you and I. That great, the great cliche. But yeah, that book is amazing. Like going back to the original question of like foundational influences, that book blew my mind when I first read it as a teenager.
I read it in high school and I was like, I probably would get more of this later, and read it again in my 30s, I think, when I got the Folio Society edition, and I was just like, wow, still good, still poignant.
I'm going to drop one tiny bit of Nat Cassidy trivia too. I'm in the movie, the Will Smith movie. I'm one of the vampire creatures in the movie.
Oh wow, okay. Awesome. We have a celebrity on here, guys. Did you know? All right. Anybody else want to talk about I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just saw in the chat somebody asked anyone read Mongrels. That is an awesome werewolf book, Stephen Graham Jones, and it was something that influenced me as well. Family drama, kid is becoming a werewolf, his family are werewolves, and they're like teaching him how to live in the world, and it is very twisted. It's the reason I can't wear tights anymore. So
okay. We got a question from the audience. I figured I'll throw in here real quick. What is your favorite non-traditional monster in a book or movie? Anyone? While you think, I'm reading Stephen Graham Jones for the first time. I got a review copy of Buffalo Hunter. So that'll be my first Stephen Graham Jones. So we'll see how this goes, because some people tell me the Only Good Indians is amazing. Other people tell me it's absolutely atrocious. So I don't know where I'm going to fall on. It's going to be interesting.
It's amazing.
Oh, anybody who's telling you it's atrocious is a liar.
Anyone have a favorite non-traditional monster? I'm trying to think about. I should know this as much horror movies as I've watched. Does Jason Voorhees count? I mean, or is he a zombie? I guess he's technically after 6. He's a zombie, right? So spoilers, like 30-something-year-old spoilers there. I don't know.
It's one of those things, isn't it? When someone says think of your favorite monster, you just forget every single monster you've ever come across.
Right. I've watched a ton of monsters.
Is Gremlins something we can
Godzilla. How about Godzilla?
That's good. Godzilla. Yeah.
Godzilla's good. I don't know if this technically counts as a monster. I always viewed it as sort of a monster. Has anyone read or watched, there was a movie version, The Perfumer?
Oh
no. Oh,
like Perfume, the novel.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, that's amazing.
Yeah. That one's so good. It very, as a monster, like this close to total humanity, but like just enough of like
just something
in humanity. Yeah. Great. I love that shit.
Yeah, I mean, maybe kind of for me, I guess Phantom of the Opera in a way is often
nice.
put as a kind of
I should have said that one. Oh,
I should have said that too.
Yeah.
All right, we have the answer, guys. It's Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah, it's Phantom of the Opera. You've solved it, Laura.
I think of some books that I've read that kind of broke from some of the traditional stuff of vampires. Like in Dresden Files, Jim Butcher has some vampires that like feed off of like your life force. I think that's an interesting new twist instead of blood. I've seen, these new zombie movies, like they'll make the zombies like really, really fast. Can't think of very many werewolf movies that they aren't just kind of, just the usual werewolf tropes. I'm sure, I don't know. I've watched a ton of them, honestly. I think of the 3, I think that's the ones I've watched the least. So I've read like no zombie books, but I probably watched the most vampire and zombie movies. So I don't know. It's kind of odd. So what do you think?
Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant does mermaids, but scary, but also does it like biologically accurate, and it's terrifying book, but it's also like really scientific, so it's like makes you think that they exist basically. So yeah, I love it when an author takes a monster that you just is never really done,
Like
or
a
like not
unicorn.
a monster. Yeah, like a unicorn. There you go, exactly. But yeah, that's a great book.
No, I'm reading the Echo Saga by Philip Cantrell right now, and he had mermen in it, and they are terrifying. And I'm like, that's scarier than anything else in the horror book that I've read. So yeah, I can feel that one for sure.
Well, there's lots of things, aren't there? Like you say, like mermen and fairies
Apples.
is another one that had
Oh,
this
yeah.
very soft image. But
Fays.
actually, if you go back to the folklore, they're very dark.
I always
Yeah,
had a
I think
soft
go
spot
back to
for
Grim.
kappas, the Japanese folklore that have a little bowl-shaped indentation in their head full of water, and if they tip it out, that's how you kill them. You just have to
Oh my
have them
God.
dump their brain water out. It's
Love
adorable.
it.
Oh, Carrying Comfort is great.
I have that one on my list. I love that's Dan Simmons, right?
Yeah,
I
unfortunately.
love Hyperion. It's like one of my favorite sci-fi books ever. So I want to read that for sure.
Yeah. And there's an argument to be made, Mike. I was going to say that like one of the reasons why there's not so many there's not so much variety with the werewolf subgenre in movies is that because serial killer movies kind of pick up the mantle of that because they're ultimately the same thing. Like Psycho is basically a werewolf movie. And a human who suddenly becomes a monster for a little while and then comes back to himself is
He
kind
told
of
me
like
he
a
wouldn't
werewolf
hurt a
movie.
fly.
Yeah, he's a very gentle boy. He's just a mama's boy.
Show that to my oldest kid for Halloween this year. It went over quite well. He was quite stunned at the end. I'm like, good. I'm going to get that before he got that spoiled for him. But lots of mermaids and unicorn talk in the chat here.
Amazing.
Not what I expected to happen today, but
there's one. It's a short story by I believe Sarah Gailey. It's about like fairies. Oh my gosh, I really hope I'm getting this one right. But it was like oh gosh, bread and milk and salt. That was it. And the fairy was the monster. And like in like a I want to eat this boy and like wear his bones type of way. That one's really good. That one's up there with Phantom of the Opera for me.
sounds, pretty messed up. But hey, that's kind of my brand when it comes to horror. I want to be uncomfortable. Somebody mentioned earlier about how hard it is. I think it was you, Laura, about how hard it is to get things by your editors. And I think that's why I've kind of found myself, especially with horror, starting to lean a little bit more into self-pub or independent releases. So, like, what is that game like? Is it like trying to get something past the MPAA, like where the motion picture that's out here where they won't let you make a movie with this many F words or else it's rated R? Is it like that in the editing industry? Like just trying to get something by your editors like impossible? Because I imagine horror has got to be the hardest to get stuff by.
It really can be. I think my problem is I'm kind of published by more of a mainstream publisher. Like they're not a genre horror publisher, so they kind of want the appeal to be as wide as possible, so they're happy to let me go a bit horror, but sometimes it's just the right edge of sort of too far of what's too gory or too horrible or pushing the boundaries a bit. So I kind of have to be reined in several times. And for example, like I said with my evil unicorn idea, that was a bit too out there for a lot of them, and so I'm writing it as a young adult book now because it's a bit more permissive in the young adult genre to sort of say there's this mythical monster that is evil, whereas in the adult mainstream genre it was a bit difficult to sell that one.
As a horror reader, when I'm reading your book, I want to ask what happened to this author that they would write something like that. And maybe that means you're doing something really, really well with the genre.
Yeah, that's the thing. I love books that just completely do shock me and just make me sit up and pay attention. So I try and leave in as many of those wow moments as possible. But sometimes I do go too far.
I don't want to get anybody in trouble with their editors or publishers, but if anybody has any like horror stories, pun intended,
I don't have a horror story, but I think I've been lucky enough to be on an imprint that like is 100% a horror imprint. And Johnny and Nat also publish with them. It's Nightfire. And what happened to me was I keep being asked to be grosser and more in your face and more upsetting. Like my editor will leave me notes and be like, try harder, make it more gross. Give me 3 more lines.
More squelching.
And I love that.
Yeah. I had a similar experience with Devils Kill Devils, where when I initially submitted it, there were 3 massacre scenes already. And my editor was like, "These are great. Can you give me one more?" Sure. If you want an extra massacre, I'll do that. So there's a lot of bloodletting, face biting, etc. So yeah, to Liz's point, it depends on the imprint you're with and the publisher you're with and the editors you have. It's going to vary. But even I think from what I've heard from people, even with some mainstream larger publishers, how violent some of the thrillers are out there, like the S.A. Cosby stories, for instance. I'm very impressed and also surprised with how much you're able to get out of that, and that's considered a lot more mainstream. So I tend to be of the belief that usually if you push, kind of like you said, you have a certain number of a certain number of fucks you can say. Sorry, I don't know if we were allowed to cuss on here. My bad.
I did it first.
But, okay. A certain number of those you can say before it gets rated R. It's like maybe it's just supposed to be rated R. Like I tend to think all that stuff is kind of nebulous and weird anyway. Like if you look at some movies of the past and the R rating or the PG rating, you can't really make heads or tails of it, but that's because it's all been shifting and it's not actually been around for as long as we really think it has been. When you actually look at movie history, and they're constantly shifting it. In PG-13, they had to create that, and what used to pass for G and PG and all these other things. So to me, it's just like, just go for it. Same thing in the books. Just go for it. Your editor will tell you if this is too bizarre or whatnot, too violent. But then you try to fight for your cause. And if you have a good reason for it to be there, in my limited experience, but also hearing it from other people, if you have a good reason for it to be there, you can probably defend your cause, hopefully. And if you've got a good relationship with your editor and your publisher's solid and they understand your vision and they picked up your book hopefully for a reason, then you'll be able to hopefully get that through. Now, like you said, having said that, in the indie space and self-publishing, probably your more extreme horror examples, you'll see that more so in things that are a little bit more off the beaten path in terms of the actual splatterpunk genre, actual extreme horror. But there's a lot of stuff that I've seen in, Liz mentioned Tor Nightfire. They published Mayfly by our colleague, CJ Lead, and there's some wild stuff in Mayfly that, if you read extreme horror, you'd kind of be right at home there. So I kind of think
that book kind of helped set the bar at Nightfire, where it was like, oh, well, she did that.
Yeah.
I could do this.
Yeah, exactly.
You let her do that. Yeah, so,
yeah, like the only thing about Mayfly that
like
you have to like kind of check editorially is, and like the great example that it sets is that you can be as fucking garish as you want to be. Just be careful about how you mention brand names. Like that's the line that Mayfly walks so brilliantly that like we all kind of are now borrowing a cue from, of like, oh, it's not Disney. There's a couple of moments in When the Wolf Comes Home where we do that, and where we just had to be like, it is this thing, but it's not this thing that's happening. We don't say the name.
I wish that we were recording this in like May so that everybody had already read your book, Nat, so that we could talk about the thing I know you're talking about. It's so good. Oh my God.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's a completely my own invention. It's not a thing. There's no copyright infringement at all.
It's funny you're talking about, I see someone mentioning like 5-star ratings. When it comes to horror, to me, it's like any other genre. Like, for example, Goodreads or whatever your favorite review outlet is for books. And everybody will kind of look at the star ratings. And, I don't let that make my mind if I'm going to read it or not. But I know some people it does. But when it comes to horror, for me, I look at everything with a sub 3-star rating. Because I'll go and read the comments and they're like, too violent, too disturbing, too messed up. I'm like, that's just selling me even harder on it. So I don't understand why anyone would read a horror book and give it a bad review because it was too horrific. I don't understand that. I mean, it's just it's kind of in the title there. I don't know. It's just wild. Have you guys had a hard time with this? Or do you guys not even look at reviews? I know most authors I've talked to don't even look at reviews.
No, I mean, I guess you're right. I think if it's if you've horrified someone and into a strong reaction, then you've probably done your job. Yeah, I think it's difficult, and different people find different things scary, different things horrifying. And some people will sort of say of a book, wow, this is the scariest thing I've ever read, and someone else will pick it up and be like, this was really lame. What are you talking about? It's such an individual thing, isn't it? Fear. I mean, there are a few universal fears, but I think horror is definitely one of those genres where you can't really look at reviews. You need to see what impact that book is going to have on you as a person.
My favorite star nonsense that we all get to deal with is, because I agree, star rating is the worst. Thank you. You guys are all being very sweet about when the wolf comes home. Thank you very much. Star ratings are like, I don't know about you guys, but they drive me batshit.
That's why I don't rate anything.
Yeah,
it's good or
so
no,
unhealthy. It's so arbitrary, as we've already said. But like, my personal favorites are the ones on Amazon where it's like 1 star, came damaged, and you're like, I didn't do that, and now someone's not going to read my book because of that. Like, don't blame me that it came damaged, you monster. I had to get that off my chest. It drives me bananas.
I had a thing with my ARC, with my review copies, where for some reason between copy editing and the final proofing, they'd accidentally inserted a bunch of ellipses at random stages throughout the arcs. So my publisher won't be watching this. It's fine. I can say this. And so like, I honestly had so many reviews where they were just like, I would have given an extra star, but there's all these random ellipses in there. What's going on? And I'm like, it wasn't really. That's not how arcs work. But so I just need to get that off my chest.
Was that to stop copying? Was that to stop piracy or something that they put that in there so it couldn't be?
No, it was just a mistake.
It just didn't work. Oh no!
just to mess with my head, publishing, isn't it?
No, I stopped star rating stuff when I review something, because that's all it becomes about is, well, you gave this book 3.5 and you gave this book 4. That means this book's better than that one. So I'll make a video review and I'll talk about it. That's the way that I go for it. Because star rating something, I don't know. That's like looking at a Rotten Tomatoes score and deciding if you're going to watch a movie or not because of it. And I never do that, So, but again, if I see a low rating on a horror book, I'm like, okay, well, why? Because that's actually intriguing to me. I think that's the only genre I feel like you can do that with. But I feel like it is probably the hardest genre to please readers with, because it just seems like, we kind of touched on it earlier, is there's something that scares everybody. I feel like at a certain age, I don't think a book can scare you unless it's something that's somewhat like personal. Or for me, if it's something that's like really uncomfortable, that's way scarier than the big greasy monster, obviously. So I mean, how do you really judge something like that? Because there's something different, I think, that scares everybody. And I don't feel like any of the other genres, it really works quite as well as what it does with horror in that way.
Yeah, I think that something that happened in my career in the past couple of years was a big question mark on whether my books were horror. And it was because, like, they were a little more understated, character driven, but like, if you were coming at it from a very specific perspective and understood like what it was trying to do, it is really scary. It was scary to me. But people define horror in so many different ways. For some people, horror is camp, it's slashers, it's stuff like that. So it really runs the gamut. And I think it's, Sadie Hartman had a great post about this sort of recently, where she was like, can we stop policing what is horror and what is not? Like, because it's like you just said, things are sometimes also being uncomfortable is really scary. And I love leaning into that. Like, a gory scene with a lot of blood and guts is, I'm going to be like, cool, what else? But if I'm like really nervous being around this one character, that's better for me. But you never know.
I'm ripping that armchair watching the scary movie. It's doing its job to me. And I feel like a really good horror book will do that to me. Like, I know it's happening, but I can't stop it. And I don't want to keep reading, but I'm going to, damn it. Yeah. That's the good stuff.
Yeah, I think in writing, I write mainly Gothic books, which is, kind of Gothic horror is a different kind of horror. And that can be difficult as well, because, again, I'm not always trying to scare you. I'm just trying to make you feel really uncomfortable and not really know what's going on some of the times. Sometimes it's meant to be a bit like a fever dream. and people don't always enjoy that, or they come to it with different expectations. So yeah, I mean, we're lucky in that it's such a rich genre and there's so much to it. But yeah, it can be one of the very hard genres to review and to judge.
There are a lot of snobs in that category, because I know when again, back to Interview with the Vampire, I put Interview with the Vampire as one of my favorite horror books of all time. And a lot of comments I got was, well, Anne Rice isn't actually horror, she's gothic horror. And I'm like, okay, good to know. So,
yeah, I think with horror, there can be, I think one of the reasons you can get such strong responses from horror as well is that oftentimes it's shelved under a different genre. Like, I don't read reviews for my book unless it's something that I've been sent by my editor or agent or whatever. Yeah. But, you know, with the Hunter's Gambit, I wrote something that's designed to be pretty horrifying. It's designed to kind of have that sort of edge of your seat, someone could be murdered at any moment type of thing. And it got shelved as romantasy. Oh. Well, there's a romance in it, but, you know, so much of the romance is, oh, these people are going to be taking advantage of the main character. And, you know, there's I would not shelve it with romance, shall we say. But some of the responses I got were definitely like, I picked up a romantasy. I did not expect it to be this gory. I didn't expect it to be this suspenseful. And I think oftentimes you can get that with horror. Like, people will pick up on like, oh, there's a romance in it. Should we shelve it with romance? Oh, there's more like mystery to it. Should we shelve it as like a murder mystery? And then somebody who's expecting like an Agatha Christie book might pick it up if it's shelved as a murder mystery and be very surprised. And I think that can be one of the difficulties with horror, is it being shelved under so many different potential categories that people don't know what they're getting when they pick it up.
It's like during the Twilight time, anything they could put under paranormal teen romance, they were. Right now, if they can find a way to get it as romantasy, which is selling like hotcakes, they're going to do that. Like, I talked to Joe Abercrombie, who wrote The First Law, and something about his second series he did got labeled as YA. And I was asking him why exactly that was, because I read it and he get YA out of it. He's like, well, basically I had a teenage female protagonist, and so they thought that would sell better if they put it under YA. And then people read it and said, this isn't YA, you know. So yeah, I can understand that quite a bit. But getting labeled as romantasy, that's interesting.
I had to market it that way too, because that was, you know, what my editor, well, not my editor, but that was what my publisher said it was. So then I wasn't going to disagree with my publisher. So then I was posting things on my Instagram, tagging it as romantasy, because I was like, I can't just tell my audience like, hey, ignore my publisher, because you can't do that. It was definitely interesting that it got shelved that way.
I think one of the issues is that we live in like the social media age at the moment, which is obsessed with categorization. And the reason it's obsessed with that is because to produce content, you have to put things into categories. You have to be like, what can I say about this new book? It's a YA romantasy. What can I say about this new book? It's a horror thriller. But no one's actually agreed on the categories. It's like we invented the social media age, but we forgot to agree on the categories. So you were just talking about YA, Mike. That's a great example. No one knows what young adult is. You can ask 1,000 different publishers, 1,000 different editors, 1,000 different authors. No one knows. We've just agreed to not know what it means. So you get these very adult reading books that are called YA. And I'm like, that's not YA. And I'm like, why is it YA? Just because there's a couple of young people in it. Is that the rule? And with horror as well, no one really knows what horror is, which I think is quite good. But a lot of people on social media are like, well, it's got to be scary. I'm like, well, no, a thriller can be horror. So someone the other day said The Dark Knight is a horror film, and now I've got to go back and watch The Dark Knight because I think they're right, because the Joker's like the horror character. Mm-hmm. The Usual Suspects is a horror film. It's one of my favorite films ever. Usual Suspects is a horror film. Go back and watch it. It's a horror film. You know, Kaiser Soze is the horrific character. So no one really knows what these categories are, but everyone's pretending that they are. And so I think you see that a lot in horror, but I think you also see it a lot in fantasy. Like, a lot of readers were very confused at what mine was. Some people thought it was a young adult, because I guess some of my, stuff is a bit. So yeah, I think we've just entered a new era without defining stuff, and I think we're seeing the results of that.
I talked to Jay Kristoff about the Nevernight Chronicle, which is nuts for young readers.
I'm
but
reading that now. I'm
it was
reading it now.
marketed as that, and he was saying like some of the most angry messages he's ever got is people who bought those for their teenage daughters. It was like, "This is smut," and he's like, "Thanks for buying it," you know.
It's
So
great,
no-
but yeah,
no,
it's
me
not
not.
YA. I agree.
oh no! I said that's the kind of book that like I'd be reading it at work, and I'd be like, "Does anybody know what I'm reading right now?" Yeah. Jay doesn't. You want to talk about spice? Jay's got all the spice. Yeah.
Just the Scholarman's trilogy by Naomi Novik. That's called YA. That is not YA. That's one of the darkest things I've ever read. How on earth is that ever been called YA? That's mad.
Adam Caesar's work is like that too. Like Clown in the Cornfield and Influencer are so fucking violent and insane, and yet they're YA. And it's also, I just wanted to say real quick, it's also funny and frustrating as hell when it happens in the reverse too. Like I remember when Cormac McCarthy's The Road came out, and people who would never deign to read a horror novel in their fucking lives were like, this is the bleakest, darkest exploration of existential angst I've ever read. What a brilliant expose into the fragility of society. And anyone who had like read The Stand was like, it's just another post-apocalyptic novel. Like I've read Swan Song, The Stand, Earth Abide. Like people in the horror genre were like, yeah, it's just a horror story. But you slap a literature label on it, a Gen Lit label on it, you take away the quotation marks, and suddenly people are like, oh.
The name Cormac McCarthy doesn't hurt either. I feel like
no.
That usually gets me lit up on some things there. Yeah, I guess that can happen. One last topic before we kind of start to wrap things up here is we haven't talked about zombies very much. And I don't think anyone here has actually written any zombie stories. I might be wrong. Is it anything that you guys would entertain in the future?
I would love to write a zombie story.
Would your zombies talk? I think that'd be a nice twist.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think so. That's really interesting. I would love to see what I could do with that. I really would. And like you were saying earlier about Frankenstein's monster, is he a zombie? You know, that area would be really interesting to explore. And I think it's quite hard to get zombies into literature. Like we were saying, into the market. It's probably a bit harder to push a zombie novel, I think, to a publishing house. I don't know, don't quote me on that, but I haven't seen a huge amount of them coming into the mainstream.
Ed, you've already got Vampires and Werewolves, book 2. There's some zombies in there.
I was going to put mermaids in, but okay, I'll do zombies instead.
Zombie mermaids?
Anyone else have any zombie ambitions?
My most commercially successful play is about zombies. It was kind of a kitchen sink family zombie drama that's been done across the country over the years. And in that one, the zombies do not talk, but the twist was that it's the very beginnings of the zombie apocalypse, we think, but the dead bodies are coming back non-violent. They're still completely, zombie, they're not intelligent at all. They're just reanimated corpses. And it takes place in one Connecticut family's kitchen as they're debating what to do with their dad, who was just found wandering in the backyard. And they're like, do we kill him again? Do we take him inside? Do we clean him off? And this is starting to happen society-wide. So things are starting to break down and camps are starting to form, different interpretations of what we do until ultimately the living people start killing each other in the name of preserving these undead corpses. I love zombies, but yeah, it's hard to find a great sort of wedge for them.
I feel like I like the zombie comedy stuff. Like Shaun of the Dead, to me, it was like I would take that over like more Walking Dead any day, because I thought that was something unique about it. I never saw Warm Bodies, but I know a lot of people I know did have funny things to say about it. But I think it would be interesting to try to write about zombies if they're just for lack of a better term, brain dead. How do you write about them unless you're
John Lindquist? Let the right one in. He has a great book called Handling the Undead. It's kind of about that too, where some people just come back from the dead and they're like, what do we do?
I'd definitely give him another spin because I really did like Let the Right One In. So it'd be pretty good. Well, if nobody else has anything else, I guess we want to start letting everybody know, where they can buy your stuff, where they can find you on the socials, all of that, and just want to kind of close it out that way. If you want to just kind of take it one by one, just kind of go around the horn here. Laura, where can we find your books? Where can we find you?
Okay, so some of my books are only available, well, not only in the UK, but some of them aren't published in America, so you might have to get them on the Amazon. But I don't know, if you can order them internationally. But in general, most of my books are on Amazon. The podcast you spoke about, Roanoke Falls, you can download that for Spotify, Apple, that's all around. Yeah, and on socials, my socials are kind of in a state of flux at the moment, but I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky, so you can probably find me there.
Where can we find you, Ed?
I'm Ed Crocker Books on mainly Blue Scam. What's that? Blue Sky, Instagram. That sounds great. Blue Scam. You just get scammed all the time. Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads, kind of. Lightfall came out last week, so please buy that in North America. And Mike's holding it right now. Thank you, Mike.
I want you guys see how pretty it is, because I always say never judge a book by its cover unless it's awesome, and this is an awesome cover.
Yeah, that's the art copy. In fact, I've got it next to me. I completely forgot. Sorry, this is awful. There you go. Sorry, selling my book there. Yeah, I've also got a newsletter, Get Cropped. You can get on my socials, and I have a lot of fun with that. So there you go. Check me out.
All right, Nat, where can we find you?
I'm on every site, but I really don't use them anymore, except for Blue Sky and Instagram. Yeah, I'm fucking addicted, so I'm
most of us are
as best as I can. But I'm mostly active on Blue Sky and Instagram right now. I'm also trying to start up a newsletter mailing list sort of thing, but I have not sent an issue out yet. But you can sign up for that on my website. And yeah, my next book comes out April 22nd, 2022. That's the British cover. Please pre-order it, please.
If we're interested in review copies, who do we get in touch with for that?
Talk to me after the show.
Okay. All right.
Let you know. But there's also info on my website for that, I believe, too, like my publicist's contact info, I think.
Perfect. Johnny, where can we find you?
JohnnyCompton.com, Blue Sky, Instagram, @Compton Writes. And then YouTube, I'm going to start video essaying. So Johnny Compton Author, I think, is the YouTube handle.
Awesome. And do you have a book coming out soon? Or is you currently touring for one?
No, well, I have a short story collection that hopefully, fingers crossed, will come out this year titled Midnight Somewhere.
Awesome. And Liz, where can we find you at?
I am on Instagram and Blue Sky. I actually just joined Blue Sky like a week and a half ago, so please follow me there because not a lot of people know I'm there yet. And it's both of them are at Liz Kerin. And I have the paperback version of First Light coming out in March, and on that same day, March 11th. Actually, I'm in an anthology called Punk Goes Horror from Trueborn Press, which is going to be delightful. Rachel Harrison and Brian McCauley both have stories in it as well. A bunch of other like great people. So that is also out March 11th. And then I was the narrator for the audiobook of First Light, which just came out this past month. So you can find that in all the audiobook platforms that you like.
Wow, I'm still hoping Audible will give me a call one day. Ciel, where can we find you?
So I am on Blue Sky and Instagram. I'm at Ciel Pierlot on Blue Sky, and I am also at Ciel Pierlot on Instagram, and I have a website, which is cielpierlot.com. My name is very unusual, which means it's always free. Love it. I technically have a Twitter. Please don't follow me there. If it pops up, it's just because I kept it around to avoid any cases of like people stealing my URL, essentially. But if that pops up in search results, please don't. It's inactive. And my next book is a science fiction that I have described as space fae meets existential horror. And that's called Terms of Service, and it is available September this this year, but it's available for pre-order. At some point, ARC signups will be going live, so feel free to also follow my my publisher, Angry Robot Books. They will be posting places to sign up for advanced reader copies if you like that kind of thing.
Awesome. And I am
Sounds
thankfully,
amazing.
for all you guys out there, I am not an author, so you're very, very welcome for that. But I've been running Mike's Book Reviews for about 5 years now. You can find me obviously on YouTube and Instagram, and even does anybody use Facebook anymore? I still do have a Facebook page for the channel and Twitter as well, but that's just, mostly me talking about sports. So if you don't like American sports, I understand. But I want to thank everyone for making the time to join us tonight. This was a lot of fun for me. Anytime I get to talk about a little bit more horror, which doesn't move the needle as much on my channel as I would like it to. I really just love those opportunities, and getting to talk to 6 amazing, young, beautiful authors was just a real treat for me. And I really appreciate you guys sticking around with me this long.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Thanks
of course.
so much.
Thank
Great
you.
to chat
Thanks,
with
guys.
everybody.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks for
And
watching.
TBRCon, I believe, is concluding now, but I do think they have something to kind of wrap up the show. So everyone, thanks for joining all the TBRCon panels, and for TBRCon for actually trusting me to moderate one of these. That's amazing that they would do that. But it was a great time, and we will talk to you very, very soon.
Bye.